Hello everyone and welcome to our lecture for week 4. Today we're going to look at chapter 4 nuisance, and we have these three objectives. We want to understand how the injunction remedy and the damage remedy work, and the effect of problems such as strategic behavior and incomplete information. Background information as well on nuisance and the application of the Coase theorem to nuisance law can be found in this article from the Harvard Law Review from 1972. Now, today we're going to have two steps to our analysis, which you'll read about on page 17 of your textbook. The first thing that we're going to look at is the idea of entitlement, just like we did previously, whether the entitlement is to harm or the entitlement is to be free from that harm. So similar to the ideas of the right to pollute and the right to clean air. And under each one of these entitlements we would have two remedies rather. One is the injunction remedy and the other is the damage remedy. So we would have something like this table or matrix. So we'd have entitlements running through the rows, and the columns are the remedies. So you could have an entitlement to the victim, so to be free from harm, but you would have two remedies, either the injunction or damages remedies. And the same thing in the second row, where the entitlement is to the injurer, so there is the right to harm, and again we would impose or map the remedies of injunction and damages to that entitlement. And the question is whether the efficiency criterion can determine which entitlement to choose and which remedy to use. So we're going to go through an example as usual to give this a context and try to figure out what outcomes are efficient and which remedies or entitlements would get us to this efficient outcome. Again, the example is very similar to the one we had before. So still we have a factory that's polluting the air, and it's actually damaging clothing on a washing line. And instead of 5 residents this time, we'll just have only 1 resident, so that we can eliminate any possibilities for transaction costs coming through from coordination and so on. So very similar to the previous setup, and we have something like this table here. And this is of course our assumption for the example. We're saying that the factory could produce either 0 units of output or 1, 2 or 3 units of output. So only 4 possibilities, and for each one of these possibilities you can see that there's additional profit accruing to the factory. So if they produce 1 unit, they would get 10,000. If they produce 1 extra unit, so now they have 2 units, they would get another 4,000. And if they produce yet 1 more extra unit, so now they produce 3 units, they would get 2 extra $1,000 in profit. That's the second column you see there. The third column, which is also in green, is the total profit for the factory. So you'll find that this is the cumulative number. So if you have 0 output, of course you have 0 profits. When you add 1 unit, you would get 10,000 extra. So it's 10,000 plus 0, which is equal to 10,000. You add further 1 more unit, that gives you another 4,000 extra. So you add the 4,000 to the 10,000. Now your total profit is 14,000, and the last unit would give you further 2,000. So you'd add that 2,000 to the 14 to give you an extra a total profit rather of 16,000. On the other hand, so these are the profits. On the other hand, there are also costs, but the costs go to the resident, not to the factory. There's only 1 resident now, and you could see again the additional damages to the resident and the total damage to the resident. Again, if there's a production of 1 unit, the additional damage is 1,000. The second unit makes this damage jump to 15,000, so additional 15,000, and then another additional 20,000 if you go to the third unit. So the total again is 1,000. You add the 1,000 to 15,000, get 16,000, and then you add the 16,000 to the 20,000 to get the total damages at 36,000 when the output from the factory is 3 units. And as before, if we are interested in calculating efficiency, we would go ahead and look at what we said. Efficiency is simply the benefits minus the costs. So in this case, again, remember, the Coase theorem is not too much worried about the distribution of these profits and costs. It doesn't care whether the costs are all coming from the resident or all the benefits going to the factory. Remember, our first lecture when we talked about that dam example. There was an example of building a new dam. It's the same story here. So all that we want to look at in terms of the cost theorem is the net benefits. So we will add all of the benefits regardless of who gets them, and add all the costs regardless of who gets them, and subtract the benefits from the costs to get our net benefits, or in this case of course is what we would call net profits. So the last column here in gray is basically subtracting the total profits of the factory from the total damages of the resident, and we would get 0, of course, when with the output 0. At 1 unit you would get a total profit of 9,000, but above that, when you get to the second or the third units, you get negative numbers. So you get actually net losses. So $2,000 at 2 units, and then minus 20,000 when it is an output of 3 units. So again, as we see on the top of the last column now, this is our efficiency calculation, and what we are interested in, of course, is to find the efficient outcome. So this is pretty much, as I said earlier, in engineering we call it optimization. So trying to optimize the efficiency here to get the highest possible efficiency, and you can see that it starts at 0. So if you plot this even, you'll see that it starts at 0, then goes up to 9,000, and then down to minus 2, and finally to minus 20,000. So your best bet, of course, is to go with an output of 1 unit, because that maximizes your efficiency. So that would be the efficient outcome. So we'll go back now and look at this matrix or table and go through it line by line. So we'll start with the first row. We'll look first at the victim. So this is basically the right to be free from harm, and then we'll look at the remedies of injunction and damages and how those affect this choice, policy choice, and then we'll drop to the next row and do the same thing where the right is to pollute, which is the right to harm, and this goes to the injurer. All right. So we'll start without the problems of strategic behavior or incomplete information. We'll come to that in a minute. But first we're going to look at the entitlement to clean air. So this is the victim now. So the victim has entitlement. And we're going to look at what happens with the injunctive remedy. So what does that mean? So I will give the right as the policymaker or as the lawmaker. I will give the right to the victim so that they are going to benefit from clean air. But then the factory might decide to still pollute. If they do so, then there's an injunctive remedy open to the victim. They can go to court and say to the court, please stop this factory from producing, right? This is the setup we're looking at. So the factory will produce at 0 output, because if they produce above that, then the victim would go to court and get an injunction and stop the factory from producing. But here's then what happens with cooperative behavior. If the factory produces at 1 unit, the profit, as we saw in the table, is going to go up by 10,000, but the damages would go up only by 1,000. So this is a good place to start looking at cooperative agreements. So the parties bargain an agreement where the factory pays the resident some amount between the 1,000 damages and the 10,000 profit, which would be a win-win situation for both. And by doing so, the resident then would give permission to the factory to produce at 1 unit. So the initial condition or the starting point is that there's an entitlement to clean air, and if the factory tries to produce anything above that, then without agreement by the resident, then the factory will be hit with an injunction, which means that they have to stop their production and they have to stay at 0 output. But we're saying, because of the structure of profits and costs, the factory would go to the resident with this proposition of paying them something between 1,000 and 10,000 to allow them to actually produce at 1 unit. So the resident would get money out of that, and of course the factory would also get money out of that in terms of their profit. All right. What about if they try to produce 2 units? The factory, if they produce 2 units, then the profits are going to be 4,000, but now the damages are greater than the profits. It's 15,000. So there is no space here for them to bargain something at 2 units. So same story with the production at 3 units. Go back and check the payoffs from the table itself. So you'll find that the best outcome here is definitely that they produce at 1 unit. Okay. So the first row, the first cell, we said that if there's an entitlement to clean air and there's a damages remedy. So sorry, that's what we finished off just now. Here, under an injunction remedy, it would be best for the factory to produce at 1 unit. And what does that tell us? It tells us that the injunctive remedy will give enough incentives to the parties to arrive at the same efficient output. So when we started here, we said that the efficient output is going to be 1 unit. If we structure our legal system such that the right is to clean air and is given to the victim, and we impose an injunctive remedy on the factory if they produce, then they could bargain with each other and still arrive at the same efficient outcome. So this injunctive remedy then is an efficient remedy. Okay. Let's then move on to the next cell on the first row. So now we're still talking about entitlement to the victim, i.e. clean air, but we are going to impose a damages remedy. So instead of saying that the victim can actually go to the court and get an injunction so they stop the factory from producing, it's going to be ex post. So after they actually breach the fact that there is an entitlement to clean air, so if the factory decides to go ahead and produce anyway, then the victim could go to court not asking for an injunction but asking for money, compensation for the damage, for the pollution they've suffered because the factory was producing. Okay, so let's see what happens here. If the factory produces again 1 unit, they would get a profit of 10,000. But how much are they going to pay in damages? Well, it's the exact amount that the resident suffered in damages, and based on our calculation in the table, it is 1,000. So if the factory chooses to produce at 1 unit, they're still better off. Yes? So the factory is going to reason, that's fine. We will produce 1 unit, we will make our 10,000 profits, and the resident is going to go to court and ask for damages in the amount of 1,000, and we will be more than happy to pay that amount because we still have 9,000 in profits. So we're still better off producing at 1 unit rather than at 0 units. What about if the factory thinks of producing 2 units or even more? Now you see that the damages are more than the profits. So if they produce, they get a certain amount of profits, but they'll have to pay the resident in damages more than they had made in profits. So they would be worse off. They would be worse off. So again, just to make this point very clear, if you come back here and see how much they're going to make if they produce at 2 units, say, they would get a total profit of 16, right? But they would get a total damages, 14, and a total damages of 16. Better even is to look at it with the marginal profit and marginal cost. If you increase your production by 1 more unit, you would get 4,000 more, but the damages are going to be 15,000 more. So you can see that you are going to be paying more in damages than receiving in profits. And the same thing if you increase it by yet 1 more unit, you're going to pay 20,000 in additional damages but get only 2,000 in additional profits. So these are not economic propositions, and you stay at the production of 1,000. So we're saying if there is this idea of having the right to the victim and the damages remedy, then you still would get to 1 unit, which is again the efficient outcome. So now regardless of whichever remedy you choose, whether injunction or damages, as long as you have given the entitlement to the victim, i.e. to clean air, you would still arrive at the efficient outcome. This is of course assuming 0 transaction costs and the cooperative behavior we talked about. Alright. Now, let's drop down to the second row in our matrix, in our table. So we have finished the first row here where we had the victim getting the entitlement. Now we're going to talk about the entitlement going to the injurer, and again look at both remedies, injunction and damages. So let's look at pollution then, entitlement to pollute, and we have an injunctive remedy. Let's say that the factory produces 3 units. Okay. Now their total profit is 16,000, but the total damages again are 36,000. So if they drop down then to 2 units, so why did we start with 3 units? Because they have the right to produce as much as they want. They can pollute as much as they want. So great, they will start with the maximum possible output. But when they think about it, they'll find that their total profits are really less than the total damages. Remember, there's an injunctive remedy here. Okay, what does this injunctive remedy here mean in this situation? It's not actually the victim or the resident that's going to go to the courts. It's the factory that's going to go to the courts in case the victim or the resident attempts to stop them from producing at 3 units. See? So they are going through this rationale. They say if they produce at 2 units, we said 3 units, you're still going to have total damages greater than total profits. At 2 units, again, you'll find that total damages are greater than total profits. But what they see there is that if they drop down by 1 unit, they are going to reduce their profits only by 2,000, but they can reduce the damages by 20,000. So the victim, instead of trying to stop the factory from producing at any level and then having the factory going to court and getting an injunction against the resident or the victim to stop them from producing at any certain level, the victim instead would go to the factory and bargain with them, because they can pay them. Now the resident is actually going to pay the factory this 2,000 and ask them to reduce the output to 2 units. So the factory doesn't care, because the 2,000 is going to replace the amount that they're going to have from the maximum profit they can produce, which is at 3 units. The maximum profit they can produce is 16,000. So the resident would go to them and say, look, if you produce at 2,000, which means that you will get a profit of 14,000, I will fill you up. I will give you that difference between 14 and 16,000, so you are going to still obtain your total profit at the maximum possible, as if you are producing 3 units. But I would benefit tremendously from that, because now I have reduced my damages by 20,000. The resident would be more than happy to pay 2,000 to get 20,000 in that sense. All right. If the factory then, we can continue. If the factory now produces 1 unit, the profits are going to be 10,000 and the damage is 1,000. So again, it's a reduction of 15,000 from the level of damages at 2 units. So again, the victim or the resident would be happy to pay yet another 4,000 to reduce the damages by 15,000. So as long as the victim finds that it's in their best interest to pay the factory to reduce their production, while the factory doesn't actually suffer a reduction in their total profits. So you see that the factory under this agreement is going to still get 16,000 in total profits, so as if they are producing 3 units. So they are not worried too much whether they produce the 1 or the 3 units, because the total profit is the same. But for the resident, of course, it makes a big difference, because they were able to reduce their damages first by the 20,000 and then by the 15,000 from the reduction from 3 to 2 and then from 2 to 1. So again, what do you see here? You see that the parties, because there is zero transaction cost and because there is this cooperative behavior, the resident and the factory can bargain an agreement where they still produce at the efficient outcome. So far we still see that the efficient outcome is going to result regardless whether it is the right entitlement to pollute or clean air, and whether it's injunctive or damages remedy. Let's continue then. So again, this is the argument. If you produce at 0, that wouldn't be helpful. So there would be no bargain agreement between the parties, because when you produce at 0 units, your profit is 0 and the damages are 0. So you'll have to pay as a resident $10,000 to reduce damages by 1,000. For them, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make economic sense. So they remain at the 1 unit output. Let's move on then to look at the damages remedy. So this is the last cell in the second row. So this is the second cell on the right. So if the factory produces 3 units, they would pay no damages, because they have the right to pollute, yes? But the resident can prevent the factory from producing above 1 unit. So they would prevent them actually physically, basically. We're not going to go into much detail into how that could be possible, but let's assume that this is possible. If the resident can prevent the factory from producing above 1 unit, they would do so, because they would be more than happy to pay the damages, because it's less than the amount that they can get by the reduction of their own damages. So the damages to the factory, of course, are the reduction in their profit from level 3. So it is a 6,000, because we're talking about dropping from 3 units to 1 unit. The factory will produce at 1 unit. The residents would be very happy to pay this amount, just like they would have done through a bargained agreement, just like we talked about under the injunctive remedy. So here there's no agreement. They don't bargain with each other. The victim simply prevents the factory from producing above 1 unit, and then they just pay out the damages, just like they would have agreed under a bargained agreement if there were an injunctive remedy. All right. So if we have 0 transaction costs, the efficient outcome of producing 1 unit is achieved regardless of which entitlement or remedy we use. Is this surprising to us? No, it's not, because this is exactly what we learned from the cost theorem. The cost theorem simply said where there are no externalities, or basically where there are no zero transaction costs, it doesn't matter what the law is. People will always be able to bargain and achieve the most efficient or the optimal outcome. Alright. Now, what happens if we inject some of the problems that we see in the real world? For example, what happens if there is strategic behavior? Okay, now the people are going to hold out, not because they don't think the agreement is in their best interest, but because they have other calculations. So this is something we could think of as behavioral economics or irrational behavior. Okay, so a type of transaction cost occurs because it prevents the parties from reaching agreement. So they would not reach agreement even if better off under such an agreement. Okay, so they would still want to go to courts, for example, rather than go through alternative dispute resolution methods. I'm sure you're familiar with ADRs. You must have read or learned about them in your first year courses or even beyond that. All right. Let's then look at what happens where there is strategic behavior, and we go back and look at the first row, again the first cell on the left, with the entitlement going to the victim, so entitlement to clean air, and let's look at an injunctive remedy. Okay. Now it's in both parties' interest that the factory pays the resident an amount, as we said, between 1,000 and 10,000. We said that already. But now we're going to impose on this idea of strategic behavior. The resident now might hold out because they want more. So the factory might say, okay, I'll pay you 2,000. How is that? That's more than the damages that you're going to get. Okay. So let me go ahead and produce 1 unit, and I'll pay you 2,000, and I will keep 8,000. Okay. But the resident is going to hold out because they think, oh no, I could bargain a better outcome. I don't want 2,000, I want 8,000. The factory might say, no, I'm not going to pay you anything more than 5. This is the kind of strategic behavior we're talking about. So they're going to hold out. So the resident might enforce the injunction and shut down the factory. So they might still go to court and say, I don't want them to produce at 1 unit, shut them down, and I have the right to clean air. So they will say to the factory, go back to producing 0 units, and of course this is an inefficient outcome. Okay. What about so if the court imposes an intermediate rather than absolute entitlement, so how do you try to go about if we know that this problem could occur? What could the courts do? What could we do as far as designing the legal systems to go around the strategic behavior? So if the courts impose an intermediate rather than absolute entitlement to clean air, so instead of saying that yes, the victim has the right to clean air, which means that the factory has to produce at 0 output, instead of that we could say, no, we're going to give you an intermediate entitlement, okay, a relative entitlement. So we're not going to say that you have the right to clean air such that the factory produces at 0 output. You have mostly a right to clean air so that the factory produces at 1 unit, but no more. So if we actually give an entitlement to clean air where the factory produces at 1 unit, then we've arrived at the efficient outcome by design. So the legal system was designed to achieve this outcome even though there is strategic behavior. Okay, so now we don't really need the parties to go and bargain with each other. So if the factory is producing at 1 already, they don't have to bargain anything with the resident, and even if they've bargained with the resident, of course we know at 2 and 3 the resident, even without strategic behavior, would not agree to that. But now the strategic behavior has been eliminated because we enforced the optimal or the efficient outcome on the parties without the need for them to bargain with each other. So one point you could think of is that when we would go ahead and design policies or design legislature, we need to be careful about not to give absolute entitlements. Sometimes absolute entitlements will mean that there would be strategic behavior, or because of the strategic behavior in the real world, such absolute entitlements would prevent us from arriving at efficient outcomes. All right. Of course, you could think of, how do you actually then, in the real world at least, how would you identify the efficient outcome? Here we put up our table, and it was very easy for us to identify what needs to be done. In the real world, it's much more harder, so it's learning by doing. It's a matter of iterations and learning from the experience of other jurisdictions in how to design legal systems such that they would give these relative entitlements that wouldn't be hindered from achieving efficient outcomes by strategic behavior. So the general principle here is, under the injunctive remedy, to overcome strategic behavior, it's necessary then to choose an entitlement corresponding to the efficient outcome. All right. What about dropping down to the still on the first row, but moving to the second right-hand cell? So now we're still with the victim. The entitlement is still to clean air, but let's look at the damages remedy. Now it's a damages remedy, so they're not going to bargain. So the factory thinks about it and says, okay, I would rather be producing at 1 unit rather than 0 and pay the damages. Okay, so here the strategic behavior will not affect the result because there is no bargain. Under the damages remedy, it's ex post. So the factory says, yeah, I don't care. I'm going to go ahead and breach the law. Okay, I'm gonna break the law basically and produce at 1 unit. So what's going to happen? Well, the victim or the resident is going to go to court and say, pay me damages because I have the entitlement, the absolute entitlement to clean air. You should be producing at 0. So I want the damages. Okay, how much is the damages? $1,000. Here's your 1,000. Here the strategic behavior by the resident is not going to really affect the outcome, the efficient outcome. However, a proviso, you need to make sure that the liability of the factory is equal to actual damage. Of course, this is a problem in two ways. What is the actual damage? In the real world, it's difficult to quantify that. We'll talk about that in a minute. But also the idea that sometimes there could be court decisions where they would actually award more than just compensatory damages, and that could change the calculations that the factory would go through and might stop them from trying to achieve the efficient outcome. All right. So if liability does not equal actual damages, so we could assume that the factory liability now, because they produced this one single poor unit, now they were going to be hit with a liability of $7,000 for this unit. Okay. So if the factory's liability is $7,000 for the first unit, but equals the resident's damages for the second, third units, if the factory produces this 1 unit, then they would get $10,000 in profits, but now they will have this to pay this damage of $7,000 to the resident, so they end up with $3,000. The resident, however, is gonna have a gain of $6,000 because their actual damages is only 1, but the court is going to give them 7,000. So they have profit now. They have profit of 6,000. So what does that do? The factory now might bargain for a part of this 6,000. Okay, so in a general principle, under the damages remedy, to overcome strategic behavior, it's necessary to set liability equal to actual damages. So you must think how the factory is actually going to bargain with the resident. So the idea is that knowing that if they breach, that's what the resident is going to get, they might actually decide to breach at a different level or not even to breach at all because they know that that's what the resident is going to get. So they're trying now to bargain with the resident basically that if we breach, how much are you going to pay us out of these damages? That sort of strategy or that sort of behavior. All right. So again, under this damages remedy, overcoming strategic behavior, in order to overcome the strategic behavior, you have to make sure that the liability is equal to actual damages. All right. So far, we had assumed this important assumption, and as you remember, economics is all about assumptions. We said that the court had whatever information that was required. So there is perfect information. We know exactly what the damages are. We know exactly how much is being produced. We know exactly what the profits are, and so on and so forth. So we know the costs, we know the profits, we can calculate the efficiencies, all of that. Now we're going to relax this assumption. So we're going to talk about something called imperfect information. So we're going to say actually the court does not have all the information. So let's assume now, to relax this assumption, that the court knows the resident's damages, but not the factory's profits. So they have part of the information, not all of the information. If we look at the injunctive remedy, the entitlement then now needs to coincide with the efficient output. So knowing the resident's damages alone is not enough to determine the efficient output. So now we don't even know what the efficient output is. All right. Moving again with the same assumption, under the damages remedy, if the court gives the resident an absolute right to clean air and sets the liability equal to actual damage, because we know what the actual damage is, the efficient outcome of output is achieved despite the imperfect information. So even though we don't know exactly what the imperfect information is, but we know that it, so we, from our previous analysis, we know that under the damages remedy, if we set the liability of the factory when they breach equal to the actual damages by the resident, and because we can calculate these actual damages by the resident with certainty, we can still identify what needs to be done in case the factory breaches. And we know that under this condition we would achieve the efficient outcome, even though we cannot actually give a figure of how much the efficiency is going to be in terms of dollars, for example, because again we don't have all the numbers. Alright, now let's change our assumption even a little bit more and assume now that the court doesn't know the resident's damages. In fact, it's only going to underestimate them. So we know that there's a ceiling and the court will always be under the ceiling, so it's underestimating the resident's damages. That's all that we know. Okay, we don't know the factory's profits and we don't know the resident's damages. We're only going to underestimate them. So now under the injunctive remedy, knowing the resident damages alone is not enough to determine the efficient level of output. So, and under the damages remedy, we suppose again an absolute entitlement is awarded to the resident with damages underestimated. What happens? The factory will generally overshoot the efficient outcome. Alright. So the general principle here, if the court underestimates the victim's damages, then the damage remedy initially will lead to an excessive output, and this inefficiency might not be corrected because of strategic behavior. So either remedy basically could be the efficient one. So as we relax our assumptions, you can see it's really hard to predict which remedy would be the efficient one. Maybe we can sometimes find certain real-life situations where our assumptions hold, but generally speaking, as you start relaxing the assumptions, you find that it's very difficult to find which approach or which policy would actually get you to the efficient outcome. So let's then summarize what we said. If the parties can bargain cooperatively, so this means the cost theorem holds, any choice of entitlement and remedy will be efficient. So if we can actually somehow structure our legal systems to induce this kind of cooperative behavior, then we would get to this point. So one of the ways we have been doing that in the real life is as you can see, for example, in tribunals or in courts generally, that the parties are always required, the ombudsman for example, the parties are always required to first go through ADRs. And ADRs are all about this kind of cooperative bargaining. So we try really to induce this first in the hope that this happens, because if it happens and there's a cooperative agreement, then we know that that would lead to the efficient outcome. However, if we have problems such as strategic behavior, then the efficient outcome can still be achieved under both remedies if we have adequate information. Okay? But if we don't and the court underestimates the victim's damages, the damage remedy may be less desirable than the injunctive remedy. And finally, which one is a better remedy really depends on the circumstances. So that basically means that as we relax more and more of these assumptions, it's harder and harder to have general principles, and we have to look at the cases case by case. It doesn't mean that our analysis is not important, because we know how to analyze the cases, but it also means that you will have to go through the case itself with the facts that you have and be able then to ascertain whether what kind of outcomes we envisage to be the optimal outcomes or efficient outcomes, and from that we can figure out what would be the best approach to take in a given case. So whether to impose an injunctive remedy or a damages remedy, and so on and so forth. Alright, so with that we come to the end of our lecture for week 4, and I'll be talking to you again soon.